My work starts in 1980 when I formed a group of performers with whom I created public events in many different kinds of venues, such as beaches, public squares, and even theaters. So with this group, in the context of performance on the beach, say on the beach of Ipanema, I started to use a lot of different materials. I started to use graffiti, visual poems. I started to use different kinds of elements as tools in my performance. And that led to a relentless experimentation with a wide array of materials, photocopiers, rubber stamping. And I felt that although that was a very important phase, that had not pushed the possibilities of poetry beyond the formal limits that I had inherited from other styles and groups and movements before. So in order to create a poetic language that was visual, but at the same time would, I felt, correspond more readily to the transformations, to the social transformations that were taking place internationally, with the global networks starting to emerge, with a sense of immateriality becoming a viable form of thinking, art making, and writing, I then created holographic poetry, which relies not on the physicality of the word on the page, but relies on the question of what happens to language when you can still control it, but you're working in a immaterial medium that is based not on the graphic substance of language, but on light, on photons, on the multiplicity of points of views, on a syntax of dissolving forms. This piece is a dialogue between a bird and a plant. A bird in a cage sings. The sound travels to a gallery about 400 miles away, and the plant can hear the singing of the bird. An electrode attached to the plant activates a computer which is controlling the sounds that are being produced and transmitted back to the bird cage. So the bird can hear the sounds produced by the plant, and a form of interspecies communication unfolds through the network. Teleporting an unknown state creates the experience of the internet as a means of distributing natural resources where these are more needed. The basic idea is to invite participants on the internet to point their cameras to the sky and, as a result, teleport photons into a remote gallery where a seed has been planted in a completely dark room. So as the light comes in from different parts of the globe, then the seed can do photosynthesis and grow in total darkness with light from all over the world.
C'est une œuvre de téléprésence et on met en relation le hic et nunc de l'endroit où je suis, mon ciel à moi, que j'envoie dans un lieu autre et qui va permettre à une plante de pousser. Ce qui est complètement fabuleux dans cette chose-là, c'est nous mettre face à la responsabilité collective que l'on a face au vivant. En l'occurrence, là, il s'agissait d'une toute petite plante fragile, mais est-ce qu'on la prend? Comment elle la prend? Qu'est-ce que la lumière? La lumière, c'est aussi cette source de vie. Internet et les nouvelles technologies, c'est de la lumière qui se transporte.
It is this collective participation. It is this reversal of the topology of broadcasting, where you have the information going from one to many. Here you have the information going from many to one. The understanding of how network topology informs how meaning is constructed and undoing it, to reverse it, to converge it to literally a point to enable life to sprout.
Je crois que ce qui est important dans les travaux d'Eduardo Katz, c'est que ce n'est jamais des travaux simples et qui ont une approche littérale. C'est-à-dire que les œuvres de téléprésence, bien sûr, mettent en jeu la téléprésence, mais il y a toujours quelque chose en plus, il y a toujours quelque chose d'autre, et ce quelque chose d'autre appartient à la communication.
Hello and welcome. Describing himself as a bioartist, he became the first person to have a microchip implanted in his body as a form of social commentary. He's created a number of highly publicized works, often radically different and usually interactive. This week on One on One, meet the unique and pioneering artist, Eduardo Katz. The scientific approach to the artwork exhibited by Eduardo Katz is generally evident to those drawn to it, though his unique time capsule project involved him injecting technology into his body, a microchip in his ankle to be more precise, where it remains tucked discreetly away. Less discreet are his artistic pieces involving glowing animals, or the one entitled Genesis, which featured large-scale projections of bacteria growing with a gene implanted in it by Katz. This project could be viewed closely over the internet, a medium favored by Katz as a way to make his work globally interactive. He even connected a plant and a bird over the internet using audio equipment to allow them to communicate sounds. As science evolves, so too does the work of a man who calls himself a transgenic or bio-artist. Eduardo, great to talk with you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now I have to ask you, you're considered the father, the founding father of bioart, or sometimes called transgenic art. Explain what that is for people who don't understand it.
Bioart is a new art form. It's about 10 years old, and basically is an art form that uses life in a very biological sense. Art and life is a question that has always been intertwined, meaning artists have always been interested in working with life. But the difference is that here, life is not a metaphor. It's literally life like you and I.
Now, the thing is that it doesn't have any set pattern. I mean, it's a new art form, but also it's one that's evolving. And I wonder, when you look at bioart, how it's evolving.
Well, being 10 years old, it certainly benefits from developments in biotechnology in the sense of the creation of new media. Biotechnology in the last 10 years has enabled us to work with transgenics and cloning and tissue culture. And no doubt, there will be also new media, new biomedia developed in the future, and artists often explore these new media.
You took this very high-profile step about 10 years ago, 1997, of having a microchip implanted in you, in your body, as part of your project, the time capsule.
Yes.
And you still have it. It's in
Yes.
your ankle, in your leg.
Yes.
And you're saying this was to sort of look at the relationship between man and technology, or human beings, or biolife and technology as well. But you chose that particular place for a reason as well, which was interesting. So I just wanted to go through that.
Yeah, because I felt that in 1997, we were starting to see something different. Because throughout the 90s, we went through the digital revolution. We saw the rise of cell phones. We saw the popularization of digital networks. But I felt that something was changing by 1997. And I felt that we're moving into a post-digital paradigm. And in that paradigm, there is also a cultural shift that takes place in relation to memory. So I wanted to make a piece, an artwork, that would deal with memory as we inherited from the past, but also projected into the future. So what did I do exactly? In front of a series of sepia tone photographs from the past, from my family in the 30s.
So that old sepia black, sort of almost orangey black and white kind of effect.
Exactly, that always evoked the past.
Right.
Yeah? I implanted live on television and live on the internet a digital microchip. So what's the relationship between these two elements? One is the memory of the past that gets externalized. And through a slow process of identity formation, cultural debate, you internalize those memories. On the other hand, and quite literally on the hand, I had the microchip. In a few seconds, with no historical context, with no tradition, with no identity formation, with nothing, with just a gesture of injection, in a few seconds, dramatically and traumatically as well,
boom, the microchip goes into the body. It's a memory microchip. It's a microchip that stores memory, digital information. So what's the relationship between the complex, subjective, processual internalization of those photographs and the abrupt internalization of digital memory? And the body, in this case, my body, becomes the interface where these two questions come together.
What, in your opinion, are the boundaries between science and art? What thresholds wouldn't you cross, for example?
Well, we have come to a level of specialization between the disciplines that throughout the history of humankind, that we see quite clearly that art is, in fact, quite distinct from science. In what ways, for example, today? Science is based on a hypothesis that goes through a series of tests, and then you arrive at a proof, meaning that your hypothesis has been demonstrated through these steps. And if that proof that you arrive at and those methods that you employ can be replicated by others, no matter where, then the notion of truth is built, is constructed, and then shared. It's really ultimately the sharing of that evidence that forms the idea of truth. That's how science basically works. Art doesn't work that way. Art is essentially individual. Art is a singularity. I, as an individual, subjectively, produce something that I cannot repeat, neither do I want to repeat. If others can duplicate that, that's usually called plagiarism.
Welcome back. You're watching 101. We're talking with bioartist Dr. Eduardo Katz about his innovative work in the field of bioart. And one of the things that took place in 2006 was Nature magazine said you were one of the people who had contributed the most to the field of bioart and biotechnology in particular in this past decade. And I wonder where you see this art form and science form, you know, hybrid sort of nature that it is, going in the future. Where do you expect it to go?
I think that bioart has many different places to go. One is its presence in the largest contemporary art scene that is created through biennials, art fairs, museum exhibitions, gallery exhibitions, collections. In other words, to circulate together with paintings and photography and video and sculpture.
More of the mainstream, you mean?
Mainstream.
Yeah.
So that's one aspect of it. The other is its presence in museum collections. So a sense of distributed presence is also part of the future. Another aspect of it is that bioart will inevitably move closer to a more intimate scale. There will be artworks that will, for example, bioartworks that will be present in living rooms of collectors, but as well as in museum collections. Another aspect of it is preservation. Bioart brings questions of museum preservation to a whole new level. In the last 30, 40 years, museums have been dealing with a whole new array of media. For example, video, digital, decaying materials, etc., have really given conservators a headache. They haven't seen anything yet, because when we're talking about an actual living being, if you have a new flower, for example, created by an artist, you're going to have to collect seeds to perpetuate that flower. And that becomes part of conservation museums. So there are many, many different aspects.
From your work, what were your most defining moments? What do you feel were the most important moments in your life?
In 1983 was my first breakthrough when I created holographic poetry. Holographic poetry is poetry written with light in space-time. And that was a breakthrough for me because until that moment, even my own conception of poetry was primarily predicated on the book. But I felt that culturally we're moving into a realm of fluid information flow that would be resonating with the digital realm. So I started to hybridize holography and digital technology to write poems that existed in space and time with light, that dissipate as you look at it. So and I developed that work for about 10 years. Having created a model of language that is fluid, in 1986 came another important moment for me when I proposed the idea of telepresence art. And telepresence art basically means that you take a telecommunications medium, for example, the telephone, when two people talk on the telephone, they are aware of each other's remote presence. So, to take an example, New York and Paris. John talks to Carl. John is in New York, Carl is in Paris. John knows that Carl is in Paris, Carl knows that John is in Paris. Telepresence does the opposite. Telepresence allows John, who is in New York, to be telepresent in Paris without ever leaving New York. How? I create tele-robotic bodies. So, for example, I can put a tele-robotic body in Paris, and John can look through the eye of the tele-robot, can move things around, can say hello to people, can do different things in a remote location physically. That's telepresence. I continue to develop that, and in '97, with time capsule that we discussed already, when I implanted the microchip, I coined the term bioart. And from then on, transgenic art. So these are really highlights in my trajectory.
What is your favorite piece of all the pieces you've done? 'Cause you've done some pretty innovative stuff. What did you enjoy the most or really relate to the most?
Ooh, that's a difficult one, because it's almost like asking you to choose your favorite child.
Yeah.
Genesis is another artwork of mine that has been on the road non-stop for 10 years. It has been shown at more than 35 museums around the world, and it's a piece that obviously continues to resonate. But the GFP Bunny that involves the creation of Alba is my best known work.
I wanted to ask you about Alba, because you fly a flag outside your house which has a silhouette of a green bunny, because there was a bit of a dispute in the end over Alba's fate. Tell us about that.
Well, GFP Bunny is an artwork
and it's a green fluorescent bunny, I should point out as well.
Yes, yes. GFP Bunny is an artwork that involved the creation of a green glowing bunny, a green fluorescent bunny. What does this mean? Well, bunnies don't glow. So I created a bunny that does glow. That is to say, an animal that nature did not produce and could not produce, because the gene that allows the bunny to glow comes from the jellyfish, and nature alone cannot cross a rabbit with a jellyfish. So why, one perhaps less familiar with contemporary art would ask, why is it that one goes down that route? In my studies, I have not been able to find one culture, one tribe, one group of people anywhere in the world that has not developed a mythology of some sort, that has not imagined new beings, different beings. However, now we have something different. Now we can go from myth to medium, from legend to life. In the 21st century, we have a significant cultural transformation. So what happens when we cross that bridge was the first question I wanted to ask. Is the first gesture that I wanted to do. And I say gesture like a painter would make a gesture on the canvas that expresses an idea. In my case, it's a physical as well as a philosophical gesture. Number two, when you bring a life form into the world, you cannot treat that life form as you treat a car or a vase or a bottle. That being is alive, and it immediately demands our responsibility, as in the sense of response, being responsible for that being. So that was number two. I wanted to bring Alba, the bunny, home to me so that I could be personally responsible for her. Number three, when an artist creates a new life form and brings that life form from the laboratory to the home, to private spaces, or to the museum or gallery, another private space, bridges are crossed. Disciplines are crossed. So I wanted to produce, to stimulate dialogue between people from different walks of life.
It sounds, I mean, I'm sure you had this from people, you know, the critics would say, it sounds like in creating a life form, you're playing God, or perhaps even the animal activists who say, well, wait a minute, you know, what are you doing, making a rabbit glow? Did you face that kind of stuff?
Yeah, quite frequently. But I don't really think that the question is necessarily warranted, because humans have participated in the largest, in the larger evolutionary cycle of the planet in many different ways. Animals have participated in human history. We have participated in the history of animals as well. There is a common tendency, for example, to say that we domesticated animals, or the dog, for example, the first domesticated animal, in an aggressive, submissive manner, when genetic history as well as natural history suggests otherwise, that those early wolves that were not dogs yet, that were not shy from coming into contact with the human realm, got closer, followed nomadic groups, got intertwined with them, and from that things evolved. So we have the tendency to simplify this relationship. And in the case of Alba, my green glowing bunny, I would ask the question, why is it that she would not have the right to be born?
In terms of projects that you'd like to do, anything major outstanding, is there anything you can tell us that you're looking forward to doing that you haven't had a chance to yet?
I have been working on several projects, including one that for the University of Minnesota in St. Paul and Minneapolis both, that I've been working on this project for about 4 years. It's not quite ready. I hope to finish it in 2008. It will involve many things, but it will also involve a very large public sculpture that is really, really building size, but derived from something very small that I'm creating. So this relationship between the microscopic and the macroscopic, which I also explore in Genesis, what does it tell us? It tells us about shifting points of view. The world will look as different as many points of view we're able to entertain.
What do you want your legacy to be, Eduardo? What would you like, how would you like people to remember you?
I would like to be remembered as someone who was not afraid to take risks, that was true to himself, who was interested in true interdisciplinary and open thought, art, and life.
I wish you luck with that. Dr. Eduardo Katz, thank you very much for speaking with us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
I put up an image that, for those who know my work, would know me for this work. But because here at the fair, I have a solo show focused on my works from the 80s, I thought that it would be interesting to do something different, to actually talk about the works that are here and a little bit of the context in which these works were made, and show a few other things that are not on view here. You may know that here at the fair, I have a solo show with England & Company, and the show is curated by Rolando Carmona, who is a Paris-based curator. So Rolando selected a series of works from the 80s representative of different directions that I took throughout the 80s. And in the exhibition, we have works that represent the different phases, going back to 1980, 81, and 82. So, I have lived half of my life in Rio and the other half in Chicago. And I started my career in 1980 in Brazil, in Rio. And for those of you who know a little bit about Brazilian history, you would know that conditions were very particular at the time. We were still under a military dictatorship. Inflation exceeded 100%. And there was a great deal of uncertainty about the future. There was turmoil. The government and the extreme right wing of the government secretly sponsored attacks on civilian infrastructures. So, for example, the National Lawyers Association received not only bomb threats, but actual bombs that killed people because they defended those who articulated organizations and mobilized public opinion in favor of democracy. There were arsons, there were all kinds of attacks during this period, 80, 81, 82. And it was a very particular political climate. So
together with other poets and writers from São Paulo, some of the names may be familiar to you. Udinilson Jr., who died recently and has been receiving a lot of attention lately. Glauco Matoso is another well-known name in São Paulo. Teresa Jardim, who was the daughter of Reinaldo Jardim, one of the founders of the neo-concrete movement. So all of us, we formed a group, and we launched, I'm going to say the name, but it's not what you're going to think initially. We launched the Porn Art Movement as a form of political resistance and as a form of developing alternative ways to do body politics in an imaginative, liberating manner. Today, when you say this, when you say porn art, especially for the younger generation, one says, oh yeah, of course, obviously. But in 1980, to take a word that was considered sublime, art, and join it with another word that was considered abject, not only considered abject, but literally illegal. The text of the law in place, the Constitution, was still from the 30s. It was illegal to produce pornography, it was illegal to possess pornography, it was illegal to do anything public with it. So, but we are not interested in conventional pornography. We wanted to subvert the language of pornography and use it as a form of political resistance, and use it as a form of developing an imaginative language. Almost 10 years later, for example, Jeff Koons would revisit the idea, but do it in a very conventional way. We were doing under a military regime, and because the military regime had suppressed public space, one of the things that we did was to redevelop a sense of public space. So every Friday night, we had a performance for 2 years in a row. The movement lasted from 1980 to 82. Every Friday night, we had a performance in the very center of Rio de Janeiro. If you know Rio, it was at Cinelândia. And we also did a lot of public events in other locations. We published zines. We used the Mail Art Network. So I'm going to show you here a video of the very last organized public event that we did on Ipanema Beach in 1982. It runs for about 4 minutes or so.
Masturbação literária não gera porra nenhuma. Solenemente se prega a suruba literária. Vejo que uma grande pica incandescente se ergue em direção à buceta da terra. É o princípio de uma nova era. Nela se venderão as coisas boas da vida, em todos os sentidos. A palavra sacanagem não será mais indecente, que a poesia então se fará necessária, como nunca o foi em toda a história. Vá se fuder, disse um ao outro. Vá se fuder, disse o outro ao um. Descobriram a felicidade em seu lugar comum. Que tal se depois de chupar o meu pau e comer o mingau, usar o pentelho como fio dental?
Morava no reino da bunda, onde a bunda e desde então viverão felizes para sempre.
Para curar amor platônico, só uma trepada homérica. Por quê? Maravilha!
I spent 8 years looking for this film, and after a lot of effort, I finally discovered it, abandoned in a corner somewhere. And it's interesting to point out that not only nudity was illegal at the time, but it still is today. European tourists routinely are arrested in Ipanema and Copacabana because they just drop their shorts and everything else and get naked on the beach, and everybody, now they have cell phones, so they call the police on their cell phone. Before they had to go out and find a phone. But routinely people are arrested on the beach for that, especially at that time. So this gives you a sense of the context with the political demonstration on the beach, of the environment in which some of these works that are on view here were produced. So I thought I would then proceed to comment on some of the works that are on display. And the movement ended in 1982, and I started to work with new media. But within that context, this is a piece created on a typewriter, and it's called Political Position, from 1981. It has, in a sense, the verticality of a public monument, but obviously switches the conversation from political parties to, let's say, an after-beach party, that is, to the domain of private life. Because under a military dictatorship, if you are not able to mobilize society through to parties, to political parties, and you're not able to develop mass movements, you have to begin change where you can, which is your own life, around you. So this work, which in Portuguese is Frente de Liberação de Trás. In Spanish, you might say Frente de Liberación de Atrás. In English, Behind the Liberation Front. And it's also done on a typewriter. There are many layers here, but one of the things that traditional pornography reproduces power relations that we find in society. It objectifies individuals, destitutes them from their humanity, and eliminates any kind of ambiguity. It basically separates people within very specific genres and codes. It has no joy, it has no humor, it has none of the emotions that a true relationship has. So in this case, we don't know if we're looking at two gentlemen, two ladies, a gentleman and a lady. There is a level of playfulness and ambiguity that completely contradicts the genre coding of conventional pornography. There are a few other elements because I use letters here, and if you get close to the work, there are other things that you can read in the work by actually looking at the letters themselves. Completely contradicts the genre coding of conventional pornography. There are a few other elements because I use letters here, and if you get close to the work, there are other things that you can read in the work by actually looking at the letters themselves. In this case, I have combined two things that are traditionally perceived to not being reconcilable, and they are pornography and geometry. If we look linguistically, what I'm doing, I am basically permutating a very vulgar word associated with the human body in a composition that is geometric in structure. So you arrive at the new unit that results from the combination of two elements that are traditionally seen as being discrete. A lot of these works continue along the same lines from the porn art movement. This one, for example, belongs to a series called Pornograms, in which I use my own body to write as a writing instrument. And in this case, you see me on the right, and my girlfriend at the time. We are making the letter U, which forms the phonetic unit of booing. Woo! So we boo with the body, we laugh with or at the viewer, we cover what is normally seen, we exhibit what is normally covered. We are floating, we are falling. So it produces a tension, a semantic tension, that is completely unlike conventional pornography, and it's the body at the service of poetry. And that is a characteristic of the kind of work that I did at the time. This is also from that period and is on view as well. And you may recognize this as being the logo of the Xerox company. So I used the logo, but not only, I also used the logic that was employed in the creation of the logo as structural in the composition. Because xerography comes from graphos, writing, and xeros, which is dry. So xerography is dry writing because, of course, there is no wet process in photocopying. But a wordsmith created Xerox, so it becomes a brand. So I use that logic in the creation of the composition. So eros, from erotic, eros, becomes erox. Erection becomes erex. The next word is an extremely vulgar word in Portuguese. It would be difficult to translate, but it becomes xerex, and then in the end you have xerox. But if you look vertically in the middle, you'll find the key to unlock the piece. Sexo becomes sexo, and rex, or king in Latin, with the R reversed, becomes a way of saying that I do not recognize the rulers in control of the country now. My body is my domain. I am the king of my own domain. If you imagine turning this composition 90 degrees, you see that it produces a vaginal form. Turn it 90 degrees in the opposite direction, and then you have two things on each side and one protruding in the middle. Which direction should it go? Now, this one is very political and whimsical at the same time. If you can read Portuguese, and I think this works well in Spanish as well, o poeta tem papel na sociedade. El poeta tiene papel en la sociedad. In Portuguese, this word, papel, is paper and roll, social role. The poet has a social role. And this is a photocopy on toilet paper. With inflation at 100%, you might as well use sandpaper because let's just say this was extremely rough. So photocopying on toilet paper was extremely difficult, extremely difficult. But it gives a material reality to the conditions that everyone was living under. The title of this work is Primavera, or Spring, because that's the brand of the toilet paper that everyone could afford at the time. Now, if you look in the background, you have this luxurious wrapping paper. So a contrast established between the haves and the have-nots. You cannot read because the projection is too small, but if you look at the work in the booth, you will see that at the bottom you have associated with these symbols the words mother in the living room, father by the window, car, motel, bed, and gate associated with each symbol. And at the top you have a piece of cloth that is photocopied. So I ask you to read those symbols in the cloth as a narrative, freely. And I work with the same cloth in a very different way here, in basically creating a free gesture in space. It's, in a sense, a trace, an emotional trace within the machine. A choreography. So no verbal interaction. You replace the content of the interaction with images. You establish a dialogue through images alone. So we did all kinds of different projects, and among the several projects that I did, I made a fax movie by placing the fax machine in the gallery and inviting artists around the world to transmit sequential imagery to that particular fax machine. So the movie self-edited in the order that the faxes were received. So we're looking at a 30-meter long fax, exactly in the order that it arrived in the gallery. "30 meters, 30 days, 30 seconds. So I carried out all kinds of fax experiments in those days. And I also started to work in holography. I started to work in holography in '83. And my very first holographic work is at the Wackla collection here in Essex, in the UK. And we have one hologram in the booth, which is this. And also in the 80s, I started, and I think I will basically show you this and conclude with some of these later 80s works. We do have a photograph of my second telepresence robot on the wall. In 1986, I started what I called telepresence art. And telepresence reverses the experience that you have conventionally on the telephone. When you talk on the telephone, you transmit your voice and you have a very clear sense of the remote presence of your friend, the one you're speaking with. Telepresence does the opposite. Telepresence gives you a sense of your presence elsewhere. So, you will see on the wall in the booth a black and white 1989 vintage photograph of this particular robot, platypus, ornitorrinco. And in this vintage footage, you see that people use the keypad on the telephone to navigate in the body of the telerobot. You see, they're looking through the eye of the robot, discussing where to go, pressing the keys on the telephone, and then actually going there, and their point of view changes because they just took a step forward and to the left. Remember, this is way before the web. This is 1989. So there's no web to work with. The only network that we had was the telephone network. And because everybody had the telephone, I simply used the keypad on the existing phone as a way to navigate. You press 2, which is at the top, you'd go forward. To the left of 2 is 1, so you press 1, you go left. To the right of 2 is 3, you press 3, you go right. So I just used the phone as it was, and when the sounds arrived at the other end, the robot interpreted the sounds as control directions. You know, it just went to the left or to the right. When you press 5, you'd stop and you'd retrieve an image as well. You press 8, you went backwards, and so on and so forth. So 1989, and I continued to develop telepresence art until 2001 was my last work of telepresence art. But that brings us to the 21st century. So I think this gives you a good idea of the context and shows you footage that you don't see in the booth. And just to remind you that this is work from the 80s because of this particular selection that the curator did, which is interesting for me because I rarely show work from the 80s. I show primarily work that I do now. But since the Reina Sofia exhibition in 2012, Perder la Forma Humana, a lot of curators and collectors and writers have been asking about these works from the 80s. So for me, it's a great opportunity. It's fascinating to get them out of boxes and the archive after 30 years not being shown, and have this opportunity to show them for the first time. So thank you all for being here and for this opportunity. Thank you. That's it. Quick overview. Through an overview of about 30+ years of work, and to a certain extent I'll be using my website as a guide. You see that the website is organized in 2 columns. The one on the right seeks to offer some indications of possible entry points that suggest directions that I have pursued in these 3 decades. More recently, I have been developing what I have called in 1997 bioart. There's a link at the top. In the course of the 80s and 90s, I explored what I called telepresence art. We'll address some of these issues today. These are often interactive works. Before the web became available, I created telecommunications art using video phones, fax machines, live television, and other media that preceded the internet, including a direct precursor to the internet, which is the French Minitel system. And further down, you see references to language. And that is because, in reality, I have pursued two parallel directions in my work. One that is directly connected to experimental poetry, visual poetry initially, and then subsequently new modalities of experimental writing. And the other is firmly connected to the realm of the visual arts, even though I have sought to push the notion of the visual arts into other realms. And on the left side, the left column, these are links that will change constantly. Sometimes they'll be live, sometimes they will have reference to a current work, and very often they will have links to current exhibitions. I started to work as an artist in 1980, and I think we're finally at the position, historically speaking, to look at the 80s in a different light. The transition from the 70s, a very intense, fascinating, interesting period, into the 80s, initially was difficult to appreciate given the legacy of the 70s. But now we can more firmly see that the early 80s were a period of transition, of significant transition. As a young artist working in that environment, I realized that there were two major breakthroughs happening parallel to each other that one day I believed would be connected. One was the rise of the personal computer, which I saw initially as a portable studio that could synthesize all the different art forms: sound, movement, interaction, three-dimensionality, text. All of this could come together. Separate from that, we had the early days of the global networks, which were not yet fully connected as we have them today. In my vision, the day would come when these two would connect, and the computer would no longer be a portable studio, a nomadic studio, but it would enable a window into the other. And I established as a challenge for myself to develop this kind of intersubjective art form for the media age. Coming from a background that was informed by philosophy and literature, more specifically poetry, these are some examples of the work that I was doing in the early 80s. These are all from 81, 80, 81, 82, 83. And this is a pictogram sonnet. If you look at the rhyme, you realize that it begins with nature, progresses to a parking lot, a sign of civilization and modification of nature, proceeds to a sign of something going in, alludes to eating, proceeds to a sign of something coming out, and concludes with fertilization. So this is the creation of a sonnet. You see it's 4-4-3-3. It has a visual rhyme. It's the kind of work that I was doing in the early 80s. But interesting as this was to me at the time, I also realized that I was primarily in these works operating within a Gutenbergian paradigm. And as this new world was giving its early signs, I wanted not just to reflect this new world, I wanted to actively participate in the creation of this new world. So I started to create different kinds of poetic experiences. So, for example, this is one such work. We are watching now, video documentation, but the work is not video. This is what I called in 1983 holographic poetry. Poetry written with light in space. And what you see in these changes, again, this is not video. You have to imagine that I strapped a camera to your head and I'm recording video as you move about in front of the work. You move from left to right, you stretch your legs up and down, you squat down, you're dancing in front of the work. Reading becomes a kinesthetic experience. Language dissolves, disappears, changes constantly in relation to your bodily motion. This is one example of early work. And to give you one final example of work in digital poetry that I was developing at the time, you have to imagine that again, this is not video, this is interactive work. So you have to imagine that somebody is actually moving through this work, and this is being recorded in real time. So the experience of the text is one that is in constant motion. It depends on the choices that you make as you navigate, links that you establish as you discover the material, through the strategies that you develop, that you improvise in real time, through text that constantly escapes your attempt to seize it, to control it, to tame it. I spent some time showing you these works because language has always been a very important part of my work, but not in a conceptual sense, in a poetic, literary sense. And you realize through these dissolutions, these transformations, these acts of disappearance, appearance and disappearance, these oscillations, you realize that my vision of language is one in which language resists ascription of meaning. Language resists even the perceptual attempt to make it stop and let itself be fully read. So I seek to create the experience of language as something that is in constant flow, in constant transformation, that escapes us, that escapes our attempt to impose and fix a semantic sphere. And as I was developing these works, I started to ask myself, well, language in this form, in this specific form of having discrete sounds that are represented by discrete graphic marks and that evolve into complex forms, that is indeed a human characteristic. But other creatures, non-humans, they have other ways through which they interact. And these other ways are complex, interesting, and they have evolved in their own environments. And what could art be like, I asked myself as a young artist, if we could tap into these other modalities of communication that are not exclusively based on human structures and human signs and human modes of interaction. And as I asked this question, another correlate question came up, and that had to do with the sensorial aspect of the artistic experience. If you think about it, all art, all of it, from cave paintings to Goya to Velázquez to Pollock and onwards, all of it has always been made within the human visual spectrum. We're talking about, well, give or take, say, 450 nanometers to about 660 nanometers. All of it, all art. But the world is a lot more interesting, a lot more complex than that. When a bee lands on a flower, for example, the bee doesn't see what we see. The bee sees other patterns, ultraviolet patterns, that we are unable to perceive. So the world out there is a lot richer, more interesting, more complex. We simply don't have access to it. And I asked myself, well, what could art be like if we could, on the one hand, recognize the aesthetic dimension in the non-human, and at the same time sensitize ourselves to this richer, larger, bigger world. So, from language and this attempt to push language into other realms that dissolves and extends and expands what language can be and do, I started to create works like this, for example. This is a diagram for a piece called Essay Concerning Human Understanding from 1994. The piece is predicated on actual geographic distance. Let's say Chicago, New York, LA, Chicago, Paris, actual physical geographic distance. So in one gallery, we find a canary in a cage, comfortable, large cage, and miles and miles and miles away, we have a plant. They are connected through the network. The canary sings. The plant is exposed to the singing of the bird remotely, and an electrode touching the leaf of the plant is sensing the microvoltage fluctuation of the plant, that is, the electrical fluctuation of the plant, and that is connected to a computer that is triggering sounds that in real time that travel back to the cage, and the bird is exposed to that. So they experience a kind of interspecies, sonic, interactive, telematic dialogue. So it's a work of interspecies communication. We have bird and plant in two distinct locations. And you see that there's a disk that separates the bird from the electronics, and the plant responds in real time to the sounds. And interestingly, I used a program for this called IBVA, Interactive Brainwave Analyzer. So I used a program that was designed to monitor human brainwaves to detect the electrical fluctuation of the plant and send sounds back to the bird. So for me, this was the creation of an artwork for non-humans. That is, I'm not going to be a speciesist, to use a term that Peter Singer has circulated. That is, I will not discriminate based on species, but the work was not created primarily for humans. The work was created for the sensorial world of non-humans. What's interesting concerning human presence is that everything that one does in this environment immediately affects the experience that one has, be it one, in this case, being plant, human, or bird. When humans surround a cage, for example, the bird doesn't want to sing. It freaks out because it can't tell what's going on. It just doesn't sing at all. If you touch the plant, you alter its electrical field momentarily, and that affects the sound just like that, actually. So you don't initially realize, because we're so accustomed to walking into a museum and looking at the work of art, and our actual physical presence there plays fundamentally no role in the work that we are seeing physically, perceptually, materially, is what I'm saying. But in this case it does, which is to say that the simple act of looking at something plays a direct role in what the thing is and becomes. We always participate actively, even when we don't realize that we do. So I'm very interested in, you see that from this dissolution of language and this opening into the other non-human, other modes of networking that are not primarily tied to the human, in which interactions and modes of co-presence that humans and non-humans share, there is an emerging property in the work that Essay Concerning Human Understanding taps into. I followed Essay Concerning Human Understanding with Teleporting an Unknown State, also from 1994. And in this work you have a situation. Here's a photograph. You have a structure in the gallery, and you have a pedestal, but you could do this from your iPad or your phone as well. It's a living plant, in a totally dark environment. And you are invited to click on the names of the cities. It could be with your phone. You recognize this environment. It could be with different media, but fundamentally, the plant is in the dark. You click on the names of the cities, and you're triggering a webcam in real time, say from Tokyo or Paris, and you're sending light from the sky of different cities around the world to a plant that is in total darkness in a local gallery. You see the sky from that city. The plant receives the stream of light from that sky, and you see the plant receiving that light. So you could be in a cab in Chicago sending light from the sky of Tokyo to a plant in Paris, for example. And you realize that I talked earlier about my early use of telecommunications media, and when you think about how traditional mass media operate, going from one to many, radio and television primarily, here we have the opposite situation. We have a situation in which we go from many to one. It's almost like a Facebook for plants before such a thing existed, if you will. So we create a global network of individuals that converge on the pedestal in a gallery. And all they do is send light from around the world to support this life form in total darkness. It cannot do photosynthesis without this light being sent to it. So this reversal, once you think of the traditional modality of mass media, going from one to many, and you go here from many to one, the exact opposite, the mirror image of this unidirectional mode of communication, we basically undermine this image that we have consolidated of the internet as a global mall. Here you are redistributing natural resources where they are needed. So the internet is not just a place to buy items, but a place to support life, literally, biological life. Rara Avis is from 1996 and continues to explore this vision of a society, of a networked society in which humans and non-humans coexist. Rara avis, which you know means rare bird in Latin, is a piece. You come to the gallery and you see this this very large aviary. You put on the VR headset, and you find yourself in the body of the parrot, of the macaw. It is a telerobot. This is not bad video. This is video recorded in real time. The hesitations of the gaze. When the person with the headset moves his or her head from left to right, the parrot does the same thing. Let's say it parrots your movement. This work is on the internet, and control and voice and vision are coming and leaving the body of the parrot. The parrot is a hub, a dynamic hub. So somebody from Sweden could say something, the parrot would repeat that, and the bird could fly away scared, which could trigger a human to get closer or far away. Everything is interconnected. And sometimes there were large gatherings in the body of the macaw, and humans and birds alike could hear what these individuals were saying.
How many people can listen to this conversation at the same time? Is it only like point to point, or everybody that's shown on screen?
There's too many people, that's what it is.
Doug, are you there?
Yeah, where's this gallery at that they're showing here? Where's this at? It looks like an art gallery. Is that your house?
That's an art gallery. They were looking from the view of a robotic bird. You're seeing through its eyes.
Where's that at?
It's in an art gallery in Atlanta.
That's pretty...
The dude's girlfriend comes in, the other says, "Hey dude, is that your house?" "No, it's an art gallery." This was in fact the Center for Contemporary Art in Atlanta. So imagine all these people are gathered inside the body of the macaw having this conversation. Everything is coming out of its mouth. The birds are exposed to this. Humans are trying to figure out what's going on. So the work brings the local and the remote, the human and the non-human, the living and the robotic. All of this comes together to produce a cultural space back in 1996 that I believe progressively will be our de facto society. In those days, if museums had a fax machine, it was a miracle. So I actually had to cable the museum by hand myself in order to do this kind of work in the museum. But I thought that historically it was necessary to transform the museum, to enable the museum to support this kind of work. So this is from 1996. So progressively you see that from the dissolution of language and pushing language into other realms, to exploring non-human communication, to further developing modalities of networking in which humans and non-humans come together, I arrived at a crossroads in 1997. And this is the work that represents that particular point in time for me. Time Capsule from 97 was a piece in which I implanted a microchip in my own body, live on television and live on the internet. I allowed internet participants, all of this live, to read the content of this digital microchip that was now inside my body, to read it, to extract that information from my body and externalize it on a screen, and transformed then, ultimately, my own body in a hub through which this information could come and go. Information coming from the internet, which is the request, and information flowing back into the internet, which was the content of the microchip. I also registered myself in a database for the recovery of lost animals. I am allergic to cats, even though that's my last name. Go figure, go figure. My choices were dog, or dare I say, rabbit. But rabbit was not an option in the database, so I registered myself as the dog and the owner simultaneously. There you go. So this piece, for me, represented a turning point. It was in the context of this work that I created the term bioart, because I felt that digital, having been working at that point with digital for about 15 years, I saw what I called a kind of digital mannerism beginning to develop. And I felt that it was time for a visceral turn, an exploration of the body as we had not seen before. So rather than creating body art or modifying the surface of the body, I wanted this time to dive into the body and start working with metabolic and molecular aspects of the body. The piece, as you will see, also touches on questions of memory. Behind me in the gallery, there are 7 sepia-tone photographs. These photographs. These images my grandmother brought from Poland with her in 1939, just before the war broke. That's her. So the microchip is a memory microchip. And I implanted this memory microchip in front of these images. Photographs externalize memory. The microchip internalize memory. But of course, as we contemplate these images, we internalize them. And the content of the microchip, live on TV and live on the internet, was also externalized when its content was retrieved. So I wanted, with this, to signal that we were on the verge of profound transformations, not only in regards to privacy, our understanding of the body, the opportunity to create an entirely new art form, which I called bioart, but the very notion of memory was about to undergo change.
Vamos voltar à Casa das Rosas, onde o artista Eduardo está implantando chip no tornozelo. Como é que está andando a coisa aí, Celso Catelli? Boa noite.
Bom, o processo começa aqui na Casa das Rosas. Luciana Bonafé, eu estou ao lado. O Eduardo está fazendo a incisão e eu estou ao lado do médico Paulo Gouveia, que vai explicar o que está sendo feito. Doutor Paulo?
Agora ele está rompendo a pele, vai percorrer com a agulha paralelamente à parte superior da pele, vai percorrer num ângulo paralelo a essa pele, vai introduzir totalmente a agulha no tecido subcutâneo. Aí, ao final do término da inserção da agulha, ele vai segurar, vai apertar, aí vai fazer a introdução do chip através de um mandril que corre por dentro da agulha. Aí, terminado, que isso que ele terminou de fazer agora ele vai pressionar para que não haja sangramento e vai retirar a agulha. Um procedimento absolutamente sem risco, inócuo, esterilizado, sem contaminação. Agora, com licença, que eu tenho que ajudar o paciente.
Perfeito, Luciana, vocês acompanharam ao vivo aí a colocação desse microchip que o artista... Pois não, Luciana.
O chip já está lá dentro agora?
Já está lá dentro, o chip já está lá dentro
So all this is happening on live TV and live on the internet, and this is a third segment.
Das Rosas, Celso Catelli, já foi possível captar alguma imagem através do chip que foi implantado aí no corpo do artista Eduardo Cac, não?
Sim, Luciana, já é possível captar a imagem. Eduardo, já é possível captar as informações
The blue
do chip
item there is a scanner.
Então, o trabalho do artista plástico Eduardo Cac, aqui na Casa das Rosas. Eu vou pedir para o Sérgio Pelma, nosso cinegrafista, mostrar mais uma vez a tela do computador. Qual é o processo, qual é a conclusão desse processo, o que está acontecendo agora aí?
And that's the number. That is the content of the microchip, a number, a sequence of 9 digits.
Luciana, alguma pergunta?
Celso, apenas agradecendo, desejando boa sorte, e eu, pessoalmente, prefiro viver a moda antiga. Mas é uma boa experiência, sem dúvida nenhuma, uma experiência inédita. Obrigada, Celso, boa noite para você, amanhã a gente volta com o Jornal 10.
So between the political scandal du jour, soccer matches, and ads, we cut live to the gallery where the artist is implanting a microchip. So I created the term bioart in this context because my work was opening up towards a new area, a new development, a new sense of life, a new understanding that life in the 21st century, our insights about life in the 21st century would render an entirely new picture of what life is and can be. In 1998, I wrote a manifesto called Transgenic Art, through which I more clearly specified exactly what I wanted to do within bioart, and that was the creation of new beings, new life forms, through processes, a process known as transgenesis. That is, often the taking of genetic sequences that we find in one species and moving that to another species to endow it with a novel characteristic. Genesis was the first transgenic work that I presented publicly. So what is going on here? If we look at this diagram, then we get a sense, a better sense of what's going on in this work. The work starts with a sentence from the Bible, from the book of Genesis. It is a passage in which God gives man total control over all life forms on earth. I don't own a Bible, so I went online, found a King James Version, copy and pasted into Microsoft Word. Well, to combine King James and Bill Gates may have been enough for a piece of conceptual critical art. However, not satisfied, I persevered and translated that to Morse code. Morse code, standard Morse code as we know it, dots and dashes. And then I created, which you see here in the box, I created my own code to go from the two elements of Morse, the dot and the dash, to the 4 genetic bases, which is what you see down here. And my code is partially motivated and partially arbitrary, meaning that because the letter T, that represents the base thymine, the letter T is made of straight lines, I use the dash to encode it. And because the letter C, which represents the base cytosine, is round, I use the dot to encode it, and that is the motivated part of my code. The other half is arbitrary, meaning that I simply establish myself that the space between the words is going to be the letter A for adenine, and the space between the letters is going to be the letter G for guanine. So if you go from this to this, and you have now this code, you convert all the dots and the dashes, like as you see here, C, T, C, C, that's dot, dash, dot, dot. And where a letter ends, you put the G. So you go C, T, C, C, dot, dash, dot, dot, space. And where the word ends, you put an A, which is right there. So you go dot, dash, dot, dot, space, dash, space. This way you go from 2 to 4. There's no question where you have a letter, where you have a word. And as I did this back in 1999, I was working on the computer, and I have this text, this sequence on my computer screen. So I emailed it to a company specialized in DNA synthesis. 2 weeks later, I received a vial in the mail. And you might be wondering what was in that vial. Well, it was indeed white powder. In 1999, you could send white powder in the mail. And as I look at this vial and I see the Genesis DNA synthesized, it's your own private Shakespearean moment, to gene or not to gene, because you see disembodied DNA, and you're always told that DNA regulates everything, DNA explains life, is the book of life, all these metaphors that we are constantly bombarded with. But when you have it disembodied in your hand, you realize that outside of the body can't do anything at all. So it needs a context. And of course, the body needs a context as well. So now, when you look at Genesis, the artwork more fully, you begin to understand what happens. In the space, I have the entire sequence. You see it's glowing because I have black lights. You have the Petri dish with the Genesis bacteria that I created using the synthetic DNA. And you can, from home or from the gallery, activate a UV light box remotely. And this being shortwave, high frequency, you are causing mutation. In other words, with one click from the comfort of your home, in Chicago, you can change the Word of God in the bacteria, say, in an exhibition in Paris. That DNA, that sequence, got synthesized, introduced in the bacteria, spliced with GFP, which allows the bacteria to glow green, as you can see, and you gain access to the living body of the bacteria through the internet. With the same simple gesture of buying a book or sending an email, one click, you change the Word of God in the body of the bacteria in another country through the internet. So I created a whole series of works on paper and sculptures and based on this. But fundamentally, we have a situation, if you revisit momentarily what I have described, that is, you had text on the screen, you entered that text in the living body, you altered that text in the living body, and you retrieved it. That is input, processing, and output. That's what you do all the time with a computer, except that here you're doing with a living organism. So the idea that this distinction between information processing, the world of non-living technology, so to speak, and the world of the living, that these represent unsurmountable barriers, clearly, in the 21st century, that is no longer the case. These once firm boundaries are disappearing not in an abstract way, not through science fiction, but in a very concrete, material, physical, ordinary, daily life way. And that has profound philosophical implications. I followed Genesis with GFP Bunny. GFP Bunny is a work in which I created a green glowing rabbit. And I want to make sure that you know that this is not my home. This ugly wallpaper is the lab in France where Alba was born. And that only under blue light she glows green. In fact, I created what I call the creation trilogy. Genesis in '99, GFP Bunny in 2000, and the 8th Day in 2001. And in all three works, I used GFP, or green fluorescent protein. In Genesis, I worked with bacteria, that is, with individual bacteria, with a bacterium, the smallest, that represents the smallest life form, is a unicellular organism. With GFP Bunny, a mammal that glows green, so a complex life form at the other spectrum, at the other end of the spectrum of the complexity of life. And with the 8th Day, I created an entire ecology in which all creatures glow green. So basically, hardly a week goes by that there isn't a request in some way or another about GFP Bunny. And here's a short summary of the different types of responses that this work received from 2000 to about 2004 or so.
This is the BBC World Service.
Have you heard of Alba the bunny? Alba lives at an agricultural institute near Paris, and she looks like any other plain old white rabbit. Well, that's until you put her under a blue light, at which point dear little Alba begins to glow green. And it's not in the name of science, before you ask, but in the name of art.
We touched on the genetic engineering controversy earlier in the broadcast. When we saw this story in yesterday's edition of the Boston Globe, we thought, surely not. On the contrary, surely. Here's ABC's Bill Blakemore.
Directors of the lab in France that created the rabbit are not letting anyone in to see it. But you can see a picture of the rabbit, Alba, on the website of the artist in Chicago, Eduardo Katz, who commissioned the lab to create her.
When you start to genetically engineer animals as part of an artwork, I think that you're really beginning to cross a line that isn't necessary to cross.
But animal rights groups say that Alba's artistic visibility may publicize her plight as a lab animal.
If this has been highlighted in this experiment, then it is helpful for laboratory animals everywhere.
Email us at this address, outlook@bbc.co.uk. Time now to talk about a rabbit that's got a few people into a bit of a stew. That's because this rabbit is at the centre of a project that sparked off a debate involving art and science. Spell out, if you will, the artistic message of this project.
Well, there are several messages, but one of them is the fact that Alba, like any other transgenic animal, has a cognitive and emotional life that must be acknowledged in a social space.
God in the 21st century, it looks like you and your buddies do, huh? The rabbit genome has existed for how many billions of years, and why do you think you're so important that you can mess with it? I think you're a pawn of these biotechnology companies, and I'm sure you probably didn't have to pay very much for this to happen, because I'm sure they'd love to tout it as another one of their successes.
When ancestral man picked up a stone and called it a tool, we radically changed this planet ever since that time. Okay, and when we accepted the line from Genesis that we hold dominion over all the animals and the fish of the sea, as a society, this is generally what we do, all societies. And we must question each and every technological advance. And we haven't done a good job of it. And I'm glad that you are doing this project to bring these issues to the forefront, to produce these forums when we can hash these problems out. Because prior to this, there isn't enough discussion.
This is Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, the NPR News Quiz.
So you ready to play, Yura?
Sure.
All right, here's your first limerick.
Old Noah cried out, "Oh, dagnabbit, we really must learn to cohabit. If you glow in the dark, come on down to the ark. I've got space for a mutant green
rabbit." Yes. Unbelievable as it may sound, it's true. Alba is an albino rabbit that under regular light just looks furry and cute. But turn on the black light in Alba's eyes.
Of course, this will have lots of implications, cultural, philosophical implications. Hopefully we'll be able to address some of them as we sit down to have a conversation. And as we approach the end of the presentation, I'll show you a few seconds of the 8th day and a few seconds of natural history of the Enigma. The 8th day is composed, you walk into the space and you see this blue bubble floating in total darkness. So my hope is that you would see the image of a new Earth. And you have green glowing mice, green glowing plants, green glowing fish, and green glowing amoeba that inhabit the body of what I call a biobot, a biological robot. The legs of the robot are controlled by the amoeba, and the eyes of the robot are controlled by humans, locally and on the internet as well. So there is a sense of a different, emerging network in which humans and non-humans come together anew. If, for many people, the creation of a green glowing mammal in GFP Bunny, her name is Alba, if that evoked images of the different, of the other, in the eighth day, because all creatures glow green, to be different, to be the other, is to not glow green, because normalcy is obviously given by quantity. So within this world, we are the other, we are the different. And finally, my most recent work of bioart is Natural History of the Enigma. I worked for 6 years at the University of Minnesota to create this piece without ever knowing if I would be successful. This is Edunia. Edunia is a new life form that has elements of your very own, Eduardo, and a petunia. The central work in the natural history... My objective was to start with my red veins, with my blood, and move a fragment of my DNA to the red veins of the flower, only the veins.
The Edunia expresses my DNA exclusively
not only
red veins.
Not only to be present in the veins, but to be integrated into the chromosome, and to actually express my sequence in its veins. That is, to produce the same protein that it produces in my body, to produce in the body of the flower. We have separated from plants in the history of evolution a long time ago, very, very early in the 2 billion plus years of our existence as living entities on Earth. And here we have a situation in which we go back together again. This is why I call Edunia a plantimal. This is a plant that has animal characteristics. And because such a thing does not exist in nature, we have something new added to the world. We have a new life form added to the world. And in a very concrete material sense, it seeks to change the world. The work is philosophical in the sense that, ontologically speaking, we have a new being that emerges from the artwork and exists in the world just like you and I. What does this mean for an artist? To imagine a creature, engage the procedures to bring this creature into the world, and effectively have her in the world, share the world, be part of the world, modify the world, experience the world, just like you and I. In all of my studies, in all these decades, I have been unable to find a single society, a single civilization that has not produced an imaginary being. And in the course of pursuing bioart, we have transformed life from mythology into a medium. We have transformed this vision of new beings from legend to life. It is my belief that in a world in which we destroy at least one species every day, one role that artists can exert is to expand biodiversity, to produce new types of relationships, to configure, to envision, to bring about new modalities of networking in which these old-fashioned separations between the living and the non-living, the local and the remote, the biological and the robotic are dissolved, and a new model, a more open model of interspecies communication can be brought to the fore and better correspond to the life that we seek to develop in the 21st century. Thank you so much.
that might leave us. We're now just going to, I think, have time for maybe one or two questions. The presentation went longer, but it was quite an incredible presentation, Eduardo, I have to say. So, yeah, let's grab the seats and do that. So, yeah. So at this point, we'll just open it up directly to the floor. So I think we have somebody over here. If you could just hold on one sec to the microphone.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I was struck by the title of one of your works, an essay concerning human understanding, the title also of a work by John Locke, and I wondered how you see the relationship of bioart to the empiricist philosophical tradition.
Are we on? Yes. I'm interested in how the Western philosophical canon has looked at the question of this relationship between humans and, lacking a better term, non-human animals. We're also animals, so we have to, in order to talk about the non-human, we have to go out of our way to describe that. And you basically find in Leibniz and Locke and even Nietzsche less, but you still find a hierarchy of values that places the human in a higher ground. There is the perception that we have the power of abstract thought. There is the perception that we have language and they lack. So there's always the perception that we have something of greater value and the non-human lacks something that we possess. We find this basically throughout the Western philosophical canon, and I disagree. I think that we have characteristics that have served us better or not so well in the course of our development, evolution, history. But other creatures have other characteristics. For example, as I described earlier, when a bee lands on a flower. So I hesitate to think of life vertically, hierarchically that way. I think of it more horizontally, more of a network, more of a spectrum. And I tend to see that different life forms have what Uxco called an Umwelt. That is, each life form has a sensorial world of its own. We have ours, and we enjoy it as much as we can, but at the same time is limited. We can only see up to a point, we can only smell up to a point. The dog has a olfactory perception that is so much greater than ours. So there are these multiple worlds, if you will, that coexist, and I think through the work, through the physicality and sensorial dimension of the work, I seek to undo these dualities that we have inherited from Locke and others.
And we have time for one more question over here.
I'm just fascinated to learn where you're going next.
Well, I am often uncomfortable in talking about work that is not accomplished yet. But let me just say that I am working. I am trying to make a new piece of bioart. But these works take a long time. Natural history of the Enigma was 6 years of work. And it could probably be another 6, 7, 8, even 10 years before my new work is completed. So I'm in it, but I need a little more time to talk about it.
All right. Well, thank you very much.